Welcome to Brussels Forum 2020. We are pleased to introduce the Vice President for Foreign Policy at the German Marshall Fund, Dr. Ian Lesser.
Good morning, good afternoon from Brussels. Welcome back to Brussels Forum 2020 in its 15th edition. All week we've been having conversations about some of the critical issues facing the United States and Europe and globally. And we get to continue that today with a very important conversation around the COVID crisis and cooperation across the Atlantic. And we're really delighted to have with us for this special conversation Dr. Stephen Hahn, Commissioner of the US Food and Drug Administration. Let me say a word of thanks to our partners in Brussels Forum, our founding partners, Daimler and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our forum partner, Deloitte, and all our associate and supporting and knowledge partners. We're really very grateful to all of them. And let me also say a special word of thanks to our friends and our partners at the US mission to the European Union here in Brussels. It's always a pleasure to work with them on this, but also throughout the year. Let me now turn it over to our moderator, and we're very pleased to have with us Sam Baker, who is the healthcare editor at Axios, to moderate this conversation. And Sam, again, thanks for being with us. Thanks to all of you for joining. Sam, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And yes, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you especially Commissioner Hahn. I know you have a lot on your plate. So I guess we'll just sort of get right into it. You know, I think across the US, we're seeing a lot of troubling trends in terms of coronavirus cases, coronavirus hospitalizations. On the other hand, you know, it seems that there is a lot of optimism about a vaccine, some encouraging news about possible therapeutics. And so I wonder, just sort of at the big picture, 30,000 foot level, how do you think the US is doing, and how is the world doing confronting this global pandemic?
Well, thank you, Sam, and really appreciate being here. And I'd like to start by thanking the German Marshall Fund of the United States for inviting me to participate in this prestigious Brussels Forum. From a 30,000 foot level, I can speak certainly as a member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force, but also the FDA. This has been a significant event in our history, a unfortunate once-in-a-lifetime pandemic that has significantly affected the world and the United States. I think when you look at what's happening around the world, there have been tragic consequences, obviously, to the infection, but much of the world responded well with mitigation efforts and now surveillance and containment efforts as we see hotspots arise. In the United States, because of the size and heterogeneity of our country, we are seeing areas where there are new cases. This is obviously an area of concern for all of us as public health officials. And what's really important is getting to the root causes of those. The virus is still with us, that's clear. We're asking all of the world's inhabitants, Americans, Europeans, to follow the guidelines that we've issued with respect to protecting yourself. And most important, Sam, I think a lesson that we've learned from this is protecting those who are the most vulnerable. Although I think our data are clear that younger people tend not to have symptoms or very mild symptoms, it's the exposure of asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic young individuals to others that could perhaps be something where it's a major preventative approach. So top of mind are those issues. I think our CDC and others are looking into those issues in the United States. The FDA stays clearly focused on helping to expedite the entry of medical products into the hands of providers and patients. And that's certainly true for vaccines, but also for therapeutics. And the bottom line there, Sam, is that we will always use science and data to guide our decision-making.
So just picking up there on the vaccine, hopefully everyone watching saw some very optimistic comments yesterday from Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's at the NIH, not the FDA. But can you just sort of, do you share that optimism that something might be ready to go by the end of the year?
Sam, I do share that optimism. As I mentioned yesterday in my testimony, I don't want to prejudge the data. there is a very bright line between those who develop medical products, to whom we'll give technical assistance, guidance on how to expedite that process from a scientific point of view. But on the other side of that line is FDA and other regulatory bodies. And we must make an independent judgment about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. And so while I'm very optimistic, as is Dr. Fauci, about the progress that's been made so far, clearly FDA can't prejudge the data that will come before us. One of the really great outcomes from COVID-19, and admittedly there are few, is the increased commitment that we've had with our European partners, both the EU as well as the EMA. And my regular conversations with Professor Razi, we have shared information about this and allowed us to align some of our approaches to things like vaccines and therapeutics. And I think we've been all very clear about the fact that this independent regulatory stance must be taken, because the public must have trust in any product that's approved by FDA and other regulatory agencies.
Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about sort of the international, it's sort of a cooperation and a race at the same time. Obviously, there's a lot of candidates being explored in the US, some in China, some in Europe. You know, everybody seems to be putting all they have into this. What can you just sort of speak in a little more detail, I guess, about how those relationships have changed? You know, what sort of the interplay is as this progresses between government agencies, drug companies, academic researchers. You know, how are things working differently this time than they have in the past?
Sam, that is an excellent question, because I think in fact one of the lessons learned here is that our approach must change, and that things are working differently. Just to get back to your point about the race, so I see this as a race against the coronavirus in the protection of the world's public. So this is about racing to that endpoint. And if at the end of the day, we end up with 5 vaccines that are all approved or authorized, that's a great outcome for the American people and for the world's people, Europeans, et cetera. So I think our race has to be against the coronavirus and not against each other. And it gets to the point that you're making about the cooperation and collaboration that we're seeing. So early on in this pandemic, FDA and the EU and EMA have reached out to our partners in industry. Also, as you point out, academia and other sponsors, other developers. And that's across the medical product spectrum. And this has been really important, because everyone recognized the critical nature of this pandemic, how it was affecting our countries, how it was affecting the world, certainly the aspects in terms of mortality for the most vulnerable in our countries, but also how it's affecting other aspects of our life. In the United States, for example, the economic consequences, as it has in other parts of the world, but also the effects on addiction, overdoses, suicide. So there's a real price to be paid, certainly from COVID infection, but also from the measures that needed to be taken. And so as you think about that, that creates the urgency. And necessity is, of course, the mother of invention. We've brought together industries come to the table, they've worked together. I'll give you just a clear example of this: sharing data. In the past, sharing data, because of the competitive environment of medical product development, really wouldn't have been something that we've seen. But in response to a pandemic that is so threatening to the world, everyone came together. We cleared the legal roadblocks to sharing of those data, and we got people to the table. And when I say we, I mean all of us, not just government, not just the regulatory agencies. And I think that's an example of, if we share data about how we, for example, test vaccines, if we share data about how we're going to approach the clinical development, if we do this in concert, have a platform that allows us to test multiple vaccines, understanding that there are going to be some that are successful, some that aren't, and then gear up the manufacturing, regardless of the manufacturer, for the winners of the clinical trial. If we can do that, then we can really accelerate a vaccine for the world's population. And to me, that's been a really positive outcome from this. So data sharing, the manufacturing alignment, and certainly the clinical trial and development alignment.
Are those things you think are those changes that will outlast this pandemic? Are those changes in the way that we do things, or are those necessary interventions right now, and then the old way might work better for things that are not this kind of crisis?
Sam, really outstanding and insightful question, because you're right. We're going to have to pick and choose. So in a urgent public health emergency like we have right now, um, we can certainly all agree that putting aside the competitive aspects to this really makes sense to get a vaccine into the hands of the world population. That I think most of us can agree upon. Um, I think what we can take away from this is that from a regulator's point of view, bringing people together. For example, FDA has firsthand knowledge of who has what manufacturing capabilities. We have firsthand knowledge of different approaches in the development process. We can act as a bridge among many different sponsors to provide information that's not confidential commercial information, but that speeds development for all. And we can make that clear to everyone. We can also facilitate something else we've done during this pandemic, a marriage, if you will, between two organizations that might not have thought about working with each other. And so those parts of this clearly have to continue. I think the other thing that we have to do is that this rolling review process that we've used at the FDA, where you don't have to have the complete application in from day one, that we're working with people who've never had an application before the FDA before. We're giving them a tutorial on that and working with them every step of the way. They give us data, we give them feedback. It's a give and take. That tends to shorten the review cycle as well. That's something that we're very interested in continuing.
What was your, how did you feel yesterday when you saw the headlines that the EU might not want travelers from the US even as it reopens its borders?
Well, I think we all have a commitment to our country's people with respect to protecting them. And I think this will be part of an ongoing dialogue between the US and the EU. Um, we, from a personal point of view, I completely expect the EU to consider their citizens and their safety. I think, as is usual with the EU and the US, we can find a way moving forward. That's clearly not in my wheelhouse. But I certainly understand the sentiment, but I think we need to find a way to get things open and move forward.
And we have a question here from the audience asking for an update on some of the efforts that the FDA has obviously been involved in on, not on a vaccine, but on treatments or therapeutics, particularly using blood plasma and monoclonal antibodies. Is there any news there?
Yeah, certainly, Sam, and appreciate the question from the audience. We have been working on a plasma product program since the early days of the pandemic, late February, early March. And we have an expanded access program that's government sponsored, but run by the Mayo Clinic here in the United States. And we have close to 25,000 people, patients, COVID-19 patients in the US who've been treated on that. So just to back up a bit, plasma, convalescent plasma is where you take the natural immunity from someone who's recovered from COVID-19. So the antibodies, the protein part of the blood, and you give that to someone who is sick with COVID-19. And there's plenty of experience with convalescent plasma in other diseases. So lots of scientific reason behind this, that it should work. Recently, the Mayo Clinic published data showing in 20,000 patients that this was safe. That gives us a lot of confidence. And we're looking at preliminary data to suggest that it's effective. Now we have to take a step back and look at all the data to decide what to do from a regulatory point of view. And I'm expecting that adjudication to occur over the next week or two. But I would say that the results are encouraging, but they're preliminary. Now, let me just sort of put into context what this means. If one could demonstrate that one's natural immunity, this polyclonal immunity, is in fact protective and therapeutic for patients with COVID-19, that tells us a lot. It means that those who are generating antibodies could potentially, and strong evidence for, be protected from subsequent infections. Now, we don't know the duration of that, but these data would really help us with that. Secondly, these data will help us as we think about monoclonal antibodies. What is the dose that would be necessary? What's the potential target? All of those things could come from this data that we've collected over the last 3 to 4 months. And then finally, I think these data will be very, very helpful. As we hear vaccine manufacturers talk about the development of neutralizing antibody, meaning antibody that in a test tube would get rid of the virus, how does that correlate to the data we're seeing in this polyclonal, this convalescent plasma program? Do we actually see the same thing? And then how does that inform vaccine development? For both monoclonal antibodies and vaccines, these convalescent plasma data could very much help accelerate those programs and get more treatments and therapeutics and vaccines more quickly to the world.
So let me ask you just sort of about the state of science and scientific communication here in this pandemic. You know, before your time at the FDA, obviously you have a long background in research and academic medicine. And you know, we've seen a lot of sort of, there's a press release that says, good news, our drug is amazing, no further information. And everyone wants to hear that, right? And so we're all very excited by that press release. You know, we've had maybe hydroxychloroquine work, well, probably not that. Maybe it was going to be remdesivir, well, maybe only a little. And sort of without necessarily accusing anyone of bad faith, there's just such intensity and such speed here. You know, I wonder, do you feel like information is getting fully baked before it gets out to the public? If it's not, is that a problem? You know, are there any sort of lessons to be learned from the way that we are reacting to all of that in real time here?
Yes, Sam, again, excellent question, because it's top of mind for everyone. And just to put a point on that, scientific integrity, the veracity of data, our reliance upon good data and good science is of critical importance. And there's never been a time that is more true than right now. And so I can tell you at FDA, we don't make decisions on the basis of press releases, but we really want to see the primary data. And we have, throughout our history, looked at the primary data from trials that have been performed rather than just a summary. So we're in extraordinary times, Sam. Everybody wants to hear good news, which I completely understand. As a clinician, as a doctor, I would want tools in my hands to treat my patients who are desperately ill. So everybody wants that. What we can't do is provide false hope. We must provide hope when it's appropriate, but not false hope. And so, you know, I think there is a rush to get data out there. There are press releases. There are papers in the peer-reviewed literature that are being published in record time. We've seen situations where data have had to be retracted, which is unfortunate. And so I do think it's important for public health agencies such as the FDA to look at the primary data to make the adjudications that they need to make, in our case, the safety and efficacy of medical products. Now, that being said, it's really appropriate. It's really important to provide to the public appropriate context here. So at FDA, by statute, by law, we have something called emergency use authorization. Now, what that allows us to do is still maintain and talk about safety and efficacy, but we can use the current available data and look at the risks and the benefits to make a decision. So in a situation where the risks are high, the data you might look at might be a different level of data to address that high risk of, say, COVID-19 infection. Now, what's important as part of this emergency use authorization process is that we can make an adjudication with the data we have available. But what we must do is we must collect additional data. We can't be static in our decisions. We must add those data to our decisions and then revise those decisions. We absolutely cannot be afraid to do that. And I'm just going to give you a doctor example because this resonates for me as a clinician, as a doctor at the bedside. If my patient comes into the emergency room, I have a limited amount of information, a limited history, limited laboratory data, physical exam. I incorporate that and I think, what are the things that are going to hurt my patient the most that I must prevent and treat for? But as that patient goes to the intensive care unit, goes to the floor, and then is discharged, I'm always incorporating more data to revise the decision-making. And it's the same thing here. FDA, and you've seen that throughout this pandemic, has revised, in some instances revoked EUAs based upon updated in science. What do I want to assure the world, the American public, is that we will always do that, that I don't think that's a bad thing, that I actually think that's a good thing because we're collecting data to add more data to the decision-making process. And then a final point on this, it's why our efforts around data collection, particularly real-world evidence, collection from electronic medical records, other types of data, is so important as we move forward. And Sam, that is one area that FDA is putting as a high priority for moving forward in the non-pandemic situation as well. We have to get better at that, and I'm confident that we will.
This is a little bit outside of the specific FDA wheelhouse, but since you are a member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force, are there any big top of mind headline lessons you feel like the U.S. has learned sort of on the public health, on the mitigation side of, how to sort of safely go about at least some part of our lives here while we continue to wait for a treatment or a vaccine, whether that's lessons learned from our own experience or from what you've seen around the world?
Yeah, I think what I'm going to point to is very much linked to what I last said, and I think is a worldwide lesson. And that is, the earlier, the more robust, the more valid the data that we have in our hands, the better decisions that we're going to make. So the limited data that we had early on about this infection, about the clinical manifestations, how it spread, et cetera, I believe that was an issue that hampered some of the responses around the world. When we talked to our colleagues in Europe, for example, I think there's some consensus around that. As we've gone through this, an understanding of how clinically this affected patients, that data was collected in real time and took us having to experience the infections in human beings before we could add that to our armamentarium and then think about in a feedback loop how that's going to influence the development of vaccines and therapeutics and other mitigating types of treatments. I think that's something that we've all found around the world. So we really must improve the speed with which data and information is transmitted across the world. I mean, this has to be a worldwide effort. If there's one thing we've learned from the COVID-19 epidemic, it's that we are codependent. That the world needs to be able to freely exchange information, and that must occur from the very beginning.
So I know you only have a couple more minutes here, but if you don't mind, I just kind of want to ask what this has been like for you personally. I mean, you came into this job, I assume, not planning for it to be completely overtaken by a global pandemic. The FDA is a big agency. It regulates a lot of things. There are a lot of, long-term priorities that every commissioner brings in. And, I think that to some extent it's an experience we can all relate to, right? Just having all of our lives subsumed by this, but just what has it been like for you to sort of come into a new job with, your own priorities and kind of getting your hands around things, and then it's this.
Right. Well, thank you, Sam, for that question. As you know, I was sworn in in late December, and I spent my first 6 to 8 weeks deliberately trying to understand FDA, learn FDA, understand the culture, get up to speed on all the issues. As you point out, it's an agency of over 17,000 employees, scientists, doctors, nurses, pharmacists. And great work is done at the FDA, and our public health mission is so important, but the issues are complicated. And then, of course, the pandemic occurs. So at the same time, I'm learning about FDA. I'm leading an agency that is really at the pointy edge of the U.S. government's response, because we needed to make sure that we had the appropriate medical products in place for a public health emergency. So all of those are challenges. I have never been more proud of the FDA than I am now, and how we've responded to this. Just a little point to everyone, and that is that in addition to the multiple new applications for medical products, we're on target to meet all of our deadlines for the existing work with the user fee deadlines we have with drugs and biologics and other medical products, which is great news. And that's because of the great work of the FDA. Now, that being said, we're learning a lot about how we do things. And one of the things we initiated several weeks ago was a review. What have we done? how do we approach things in a better way moving forward? Are we prepared for, say, the fall? And what can we institute long-term that could help facilitate our everyday work, but also response to the pandemic? With respect to my priorities, it's very interesting you bring that up, because it turns out, fortuitously, I had identified my priorities to the agency in late January. One is modernizing our approach to data and unleashing data. Number two is removing barriers to innovation so that we could get great, safe, and effective medical products to the hands of providers and consumers in America. And then the third is engaging the public in a dialogue about what's important to them and providing them with information. And I'm sure you can see, for all of those three priorities, they were of critical importance during the pandemic and our response to that. So as we think about data modernization, as we think about removing barriers to innovation, while at the same time protecting our solemn promise to the American people about safety and efficacy, and as we engage the American public in a dialogue, all of those three priorities will be top of mind for us.
Is there anything else you need in your toolbox to make those things happen, whether that's domestically or cooperation from overseas?
Well, I think from a European and an overseas perspective, these are conversations that are already ongoing. My many thanks to the structure that's already in place. As I said, I've had these conversations with Professor Razi and EMA and the EU as well. And I think we'll all work together on this data acquisition. I think that's one thing that we could work together on and that we all have agreement upon will help us in the future. So support for that and a lot of momentum. And I really look forward to those discussions and really appreciate being here, Sam.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I believe you had a hard stop at 11:30 and it is 11:32. So I will not keep you any longer. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Brussels Forum for hosting us and having us here today.
Sam, thank you. And thanks to everyone who's listening. Take care.